a semblance of movement, and meantime they would be wrenching the wheels and so preventing their being fit for real movement. That is just what people are doing who think to make men advance by means of external force. They say that Christian life cannot be established without the use of violence, because there are savage races outside the pale of Christian societies in Africa and in Asia. There are some who even represent the Chinese as a danger to civilization, and that in the midst of Christian societies there are savage, corrupt, and according to the new theory of heredity, congenial criminals. And violence, they say, is necessary to keep savages and criminals from annihilating our civilization. But these savages within and without Christian society, who are such a terror to us, have never been subjugated by violence and are not subjugated by it now. Nations have never subjugated other nations by violence alone. If a nation which subjugated another was on a lower level of civilization, it has never happened that it succeeded in introducing its organization of life by violence. On the contrary, it was always forced to adopt the organization of life existing in the conquered nation. If ever any of the nations conquered by force have been really subjugated, or even nearly so, it has always been by the action of public opinion, and never by violence, which only tends to drive a people to further rebellion. When whole nations have been subjugated by a new religion and have become Christian or Mohammedan, such a conversion has never been brought about because the authorities made it obligatory. On the contrary, violence has much oftener acted in the opposite direction, but because public opinion made such a change inevitable. Nations, on the contrary, who have been driven by force to accept the faith of their conquerors, have always remained agnostic to it. It is just the same with the savage elements existing in the midst of our civilized societies. Neither the increased nor the diminished severity of punishment, nor the modifications of prison, nor the increase of police will increase or diminish the number of criminals. Their number will only be diminished by the change of the moral standard of society. No severities could put an end to duels and vendettas in certain districts. In spite of the number of Tcherkesses executed for robbery, they continue to be robbers from their youth up, for no maiden will marry a Tcherkess youth till he has given proof of his bravery by carrying off a horse, or at least a sheep. If men cease to fight duels, and the Tcherkesses cease to be robbers, it will not be from fear of punishment, indeed that invests the crime with additional charm for youth, but through a change in the moral standard of public opinion. It is the same with all other crimes. Force can never suppress what is sanctioned by public opinion. On the contrary, public opinion need only be in direct opposition to force to neutralize the whole effect of the use of force. It has always been so, and always will be in every case of martyrdom. What would happen if force were not used against hostile nations and the criminal elements of society we do not know, but we do know by prolonged experience that neither enemies nor criminals have been successfully suppressed by force. And indeed, how could nations be subjugated by violence who are led by their whole education, their traditions, and even their religion, to see the loftiest virtue in warring with their oppressors and fighting for freedom? And how are we to suppress by force acts committed in the midst of our society, which are regarded as crimes by the government and as daring exploits by the people? To exterminate such nations and such criminals by violence is possible, and indeed is done, but to subdue them is impossible. The sole guide which directs men and nations has always been and is the unseen, intangible, underlying force, the resultant of all the spiritual forces of certain people, or of all humanity, which finds its outward expression in public opinion. The use of violence only weakens this force, hinders it, and corrupts it, and tries to replace it by another, which, far from being conducive to the progress of humanity, is detrimental to it. to bring under the sway of Christianity all the savage nations outside the pale of the Christian world, all the Zulus, Manchus, and Chinese, whom many regard as savages, and the savages who live in our midst, there is only one means. That means is the propagation among these nations of the Christian ideal of society, which can only be realized by a Christian life, Christian actions, and Christian examples. And meanwhile, though this is the one only means of gaining a hold over the people who have remained non-Christian, the men of our day set to work in the directly opposite fashion to attain this result. To bring under the sway of Christianity savage nations who do not attack us, and whom we have therefore no excuse for oppressing, we ought before all things to leave them in peace, and in case we need or wish to enter into closer relations with them, we ought only to influence them by Christian manners and a Christian teaching, setting them the example of the Christian virtues of patience, meekness, endurance, purity, brotherhood, and love. Instead of that, we begin by establishing among them new markets for our commerce, with the sole aim of our own profit. Then we appropriate their lands, that is, rob them. Then we sell them spirits, tobacco, and opium, that is, corrupt them. Then we establish our morals among them, teach them the use of violence and new methods of destruction. That is, we teach them nothing but the animal law of strife, below which man cannot sink, and we do all we can to conceal from them all that is Christian in us. After this we send some dozens of missionaries prating to them of the hypocritical absurdities of the Church, and then quote the failure of our effort to turn the heathen to Christianity as an incontrovertible proof of the impossibility of applying the truths of Christianity in practical life. It is just the same with the so-called criminals living in our midst. To bring these people under the sway of Christianity, there is one only means, that is, the Christian social ideal, which can only be realized among them by true Christian teaching and supported by a true example of the Christian life. And to preach this Christian truth and to support it by Christian example, we set up among them prisons, guillotines, gallows, preparations for murder. We diffuse among the common herd idolatrous superstitions to stupefy them. We sell them spirits, tobacco, and opium to brutalize them. We even organize legalized prostitution. We give land to those who do not need it. We make a display of senseless luxury in the midst of suffering poverty. We destroy the possibility of anything like a Christian public opinion, and studiously try to suppress what Christian public opinion is existing. And then, after having ourselves studiously corrupted men, we shut them up like wild beasts in places from which they cannot escape, and where they become still more brutalized, or else we kill them. And these very men whom we have corrupted and brutalized by every means, we bring forward as a proof that one cannot deal with criminals except by brute force. We are just like ignorant doctors who put a man recovering from illness by the force of nature into the most unfavorable conditions of hygiene, and dose him with the most deleterious drugs, and then assert triumphantly that their hygiene and their drugs saved his life, when the patient would have been well long before if they had left him alone. Violence, which is held up as the means of supporting the Christian organization of life, not only fails to produce that effect, it even hinders the social organization of life from being what it might and ought to be. The social organization is as good as it is not as a result of force, but in spite of it. And therefore the champions of the existing order are mistaken in arguing that since, even with the aid of force, the bad and non-Christian elements of humanity can hardly be kept from attacking us, the abolition of the use of force and the substitution of public opinion for it would leave humanity quite unprotected. They are mistaken, because force does not protect humanity, but, on the contrary, deprives it of the only possible means of really protecting itself, that is, the establishment and diffusion of a Christian public opinion. Only by the suppression of violence will a Christian public opinion cease to be corrupted and be enabled to be diffused without hindrance, and men will then turn their efforts in the spiritual direction by which alone they can advance. But how are we to cast off the visible, tangible protection of an armed policeman, and trust to something so intangible as public opinion? Does it yet exist? Moreover, the condition of things in which we are living now, we know, good or bad, we know its shortcomings and are used to it. We know what to do and how to behave under present conditions. But what will happen when we give it up and trust ourselves to something invisible and intangible and altogether unknown? The unknown world on which they are entering in renouncing their habitual ways of life appears itself as dreadful to them. It is all very well to dread the unknown when our habitual position is sound and secure, but our position is so far from being secure that we know beyond all doubt that we are standing on the brink of a precipice. If we must be afraid, let us be afraid of what is really alarming, and not what we imagine as alarming. Fearing to make the effort to detach ourselves from our perilous position, because the future is not fully clear to us, we are like passengers in a foundering ship, who, though being afraid to trust themselves to the boat which would carry them to the shore, shut themselves up in the cabin and refuse to come out of it, or like sheep who, terrified by their barn being on fire, huddle in a corner and do not go out of the wide open door. We are standing on the threshold of the murderous war of social revolution, terrific in its miseries, besides which, as those who are preparing it tell us, the horrors of 1793 will be a child's play. And can we talk of the danger threatening us from the warriors of Dahomey, the Zulus, and such, who live so far away and are not dreaming of attacking us, and from some thousands of swindlers, thieves, and murderers, brutalized and corrupted by ourselves, whose number is in no way lessened by all our sentences, prisons, and executions? Moreover, this dread of the suppression of visible protection of the policeman is essentially a sentiment of the townspeople, that is, of people who are living in abnormal and artificial conditions. People living in natural conditions of life, not in towns, but in the midst of nature, and carrying on the struggle with nature, live without this protection and know how little force can protect us from the real dangers with which we are surrounded. There is something sickly in this dread, which is essentially dependent on the artificial conditions in which many of us live and have been brought up. A doctor, a specialist in insanity, told a story that one summer day, when he was leaving the asylum, the lunatics accompanied him to the street door. "Come for a walk in the town with me," the doctor suggested to them. The lunatics agreed, and a small band followed the doctor. But the further they proceeded along the street where healthy people were freely moving about, the more timid they became, and they pressed closer and closer to the doctor, hindering him from walking. At last they all began to beg him to take them back to the asylum, to their meaningless but customary way of life, to their keepers, to blows, strait waistcoats, and solitary cells. This is just how men of today huddle in terror and draw back to their irrational manner of life, their factories, law courts, prisons, execution, and wars, when Christianity calls them to liberty, to the free, rational life of the future coming age. People ask, how will our security be guaranteed when the existing organization is suppressed? What precisely will the new organization be that is to replace it? So long as we do not know precisely how our life will be organized, we will not stir a step forward. An explorer going to an unknown country might as well ask for a detailed map of the country before he would start. If a man before he passed from one stage to another could know his future life in full detail, he would have nothing to live for. It is the same with the life of humanity. If it had a program of the life which awaited it before entering a new stage, it would be the surest sign that it was not living, not advancing, but simply rotating in the same place. The conditions of the new order of life cannot be known by us because we have to create them by our own labors. That is all that life is, to learn the unknown, and to adapt our actions to this new knowledge. That is the life of each individual man, and that is the life of human society and of humanity. End of chapter 10.